All right, let's go ahead and get our meeting started. Good morning to everyone. So glad to see you guys here again this week. We will, as usual, start with the Pledge of Allegiance. And it's been a little confusing just with everybody talking at once. So I'm going to say the Pledge of Allegiance, but please keep your screen muted, but please feel free to follow along with me, okay? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Rick, would you please pray?
Father, thank you for this day and your love and your mercy. Father, I pray that you would continue to protect our homes, our families. Father, we know that there is great suffering around the world today in so many areas, but we also know that you're our healer, you're our Savior, and we ask you to have mercy and show favor and kindness to your people who are hurting around the world today. In Jesus' name, amen.
At this time, I would like for Daniel Marlowe, he's our newest Rotarian. He's brought a special guest with him today.
Good morning. I'd like to introduce Karen Colley. Karen has been with Chick-fil-A for over 25 years, and 20 of that has been as a franchisee. And she is the one who helps us out with both the Key Street and the Paul Huff Parkway location. She's a dear friend of mine, her and Steve both, and Karen's joined us this morning.
Welcome, Karen. We're glad to have you. Welcome. Okay, at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest today, Stephen Crump. He's our District Attorney General for the 10th Judicial District, and he is also a Rotarian. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Morning.
I appreciate the opportunity to talk to y'all today. You all had contacted and asked sort of for an explanation or some understanding about where our court system is. And as we've processed through the COVID-19 pandemic, what's different and where things are headed. And let me say that it has been a completely new world for us, particularly in criminal justice, but in the legal field altogether. But criminal justice has been particularly impacted. The Supreme Court of Tennessee put down an order on March 13th, which ended all in-person matters for a period of time, except those that were related to a defendant who was in custody, or on the civil side, some particular emergency. And that immediately sort of ground things to a halt, because we had full dockets, and folks like Daniel Marlowe from the Sheriff's Department were continuing to arrest folks and continuing to enforce the law. So we suddenly were faced with the prospect of not being able to try people who were set for jury trials. That has continued and will continue through at least July the 3rd of this year, which means we've gone 4 months without a jury trial in the state of Tennessee. We are now beginning to open up to some in-person, in-court proceedings, but most of our court proceedings have been transpiring exactly as I'm meeting with you all today, either across Zoom or with Microsoft Teams or with Skype. All 4 counties have now, in the 10th Judicial District, that those 4 counties are Bradley, McMinn, Monroe, and Polk counties, have now gone to some form of video court, some form of video proceedings. Virtually every arraignment now is done by video. That's a great improvement over the previous system. That's much easier on our sheriff's departments. they don't have to transport as many people, or they don't have to move in and out as many people. So that's a good thing that's come out of all this. And I think you'll see going forward as we finish out this pandemic, you're going to see that that there are going to be some improvements to the system in efficiency and in other things. I think that's, but I think that's universal across the board with business just in general. I was talking with Mark Walkup at McAllister's yesterday, and he was saying that one of the great benefits is that it's required his people to be absolutely accurate in their orders during this time, because people are leaving sometimes with multiple orders. They can't come back. So the accuracy's got to be absolutely 100%, and his efficiency's been greater. And I think the same thing is true for the criminal justice system. I think that we are finding ourselves in a position where we have to be much more efficient. We have to make much better use of our time. And at the end of the day, we've got to make sure, though, that we still deliver the same level of services, not just to the system itself, but to crime victims. I think that we don't have good numbers yet, but I think you're going to see there's been a significant increase in the crime rate during the period of time of the pandemic, particularly the time that we were, although we didn't have necessarily a shelter-in-place order, we did have something similar. And during that period of time, I think when the numbers all come in, you're going to see that there has been a significant number of increase in reported crime. We have had an extraordinary number of homicides across the district over the last 3 or 4 weeks. We have probably equaled a 6 to 8 month tally just in that 3 or 4 weeks across the district, which puts an enormous strain on the system. And again, we're still under the same sort of constrictions that we've been under. And so as these cases continue to come in, and as more people are either cited or arrested, there's going to be a day when we have to deal with all that. That's sort of the general overview of where we are. All of my lawyers stayed working. I have 15 lawyers across the district. All of them continued working the entire time. None of us were off work at all. We continued to work as we could. I did split the teams up. Split my Cleveland office into 2 teams and sent half of them to work at home for a couple of weeks, so that in the event that we had an exposure in the office, we didn't lose the entire office through quarantine or something like that. But we were fortunate and blessed. We've had 2 exposures during the pandemic to folks in my office, but no positive tests, and nobody who was symptomatic during this period of time. So we feel very blessed with that circumstance. Going forward, I think is going to be the real challenge, because what you're going to find is that we now have 4 months of a docket that has been laid on top of the existing docket, with no additional court dates and no additional hours in the day, and no additional lawyers to process them, and no additional room for people to sit in courtrooms. I am very concerned about what it will look like when we reopen. I'm very concerned about the ability of the system to maintain its structure and its integrity, and to continue to process things efficiently. It's going to be incredibly important that my office, the folks in the public defender's office, the judges, and the private bar all continue to work together to make sure that the reopening goes well. We are going to see some long dockets. I've told my staff to expect a year, a full calendar year of very, very long, very, very bad days. And I hope that I am as overly pessimistic as some of the experts have been about what the COVID-19 pandemic would look like. I hope that I am greatly overestimating the length of time it will take, but I'm afraid it'll take that long to work our way through all these cases. When we look at criminal justice, it's one of those things that could not, we've not been able to shut the system down. But we did do a couple of things to try to lower the load on the system. I met in conjunction with all the sheriffs and all the chiefs across the district and proposed to them that we go to a citation system for misdemeanor offenders and all nonviolent felony offenders that committed a crime during this period of time, because one of the things that we had to do, both by order of the Supreme Court, but also just as a matter of good public policy, was to lower our jail census. And we did that by a couple of ways that were very responsible. First of all, we took the list of misdemeanor offenders of all kinds and found the ones that had not been able to make bond. We found the ones that were in on a violation of their misdemeanor probation. And we found people who were serving nonviolent sentences. And we evaluated all those for either an early release or an OR bond or something like that. Our sheriffs provided a list to us from all 4 counties. We disseminated that list to all the chiefs across the district. We asked their departments to give us their thoughts on defendants who were safe to release back into the community and ones who weren't. And as a result, we were able to trim about 40%, 30 to 40% of the incarcerated numbers across the district. That hopefully, that's a trend that we can continue to keep those managed well. We are seeing good results with misdemeanor offenders who are out on OR bonds but have been placed on sort of their own version of the Tennessee Pledge. They are maintaining their good citizenship, we believe. But that is going to continue to challenge us. We are beginning next week here in Bradley County a reset week. That week will be an opportunity for anybody who has failed to appear on their misdemeanor cases, an opportunity to come in and get your case rescheduled. Your case is still going to have to be dealt with. You're still going to have to be responsible for whatever you've done wrong. You're still going to have to come back to court, and there still will be a sentence at the end, but it'll keep you from being picked up when we resume normal law enforcement operations. And we're doing that, frankly, so that we don't, again, overwhelm the jail, number one, but number two, so that we don't overwhelm the court system. If you can imagine, when we go back to normal law enforcement operations and every patrol officer begins enforcing every misdemeanor failure to appear, we could add 200 or 300 people almost overnight to every jail in the district. And I think you all can imagine, if I dumped 450 people in a court docket on a Monday morning, there would not be a bunch of happy judges, nor would my lawyers or anybody else be happy. So we're going to try to get ahead of that. I think Sheriff Lawson was very smart in suggesting that, and I immediately supported that along with Chief Gibson. And so you're going to see things like that as we go forward. Government has to change the same way that everything else has changed. We can't sit back and assume that we can do the same business the same way for the foreseeable future. What we have to do is we have to be innovative. We have to be flexible. And at the end of the day, we have to do all that under the umbrella of keeping the public safe and continuing to make people accountable and continuing to make people do the sorts of things that we expect them to do as good citizens. I'm happy. I thought, rather than me spending a whole lot of time talking, I thought I would leave most of my time for questions for you all. I'm here as long as you all have questions and are willing to stay on. So with that, unless there's something specific, I'll just open it up for questions if that's all right.
I have two questions. Excuse me. First of all, excuse me, Philomena, can you turn yours down, your speech down? I think it's getting feedback. But at any rate, number one, are you getting an increase or about the same on drug and opioid crimes? And nationally, there seems to be an increase on like domestic violence, child abuse. Is that true here, or do you have any numbers on any of that stuff yet?
Thank you for both of those. And I think we don't have numbers yet, but I can tell you, we don't have solid numbers yet, but I can tell you that both domestic violence and child abuse crimes, not so much, I'm not seeing the kind of increase in child abuse that we've heard reported nationally, but I have seen the same number, an increase, a significant increase in what we have as reported domestic violence. Fortunately, most of those are not life-threatening. Those are less serious forms of domestic abuse. Not that any domestic abuse is acceptable, but it is not the kind that's requiring a lot of hospitalizations. As for the opioid situation, it is an absolute disaster. The number of overdoses have skyrocketed in the last 2 months. We have had, I could go back and count, but I believe at last count I've had 17 overdoses in the last week across the district, and over half of those have ended up with someone dying. Those numbers are tragic, but they go along with the sense of the sense of hopelessness that an emergency like this causes. But in terms of drug sales and drug uses, yes, absolutely, there's been an increase. And unfortunately, part of that has been due to the stimulus money. We have had a number of people who have taken their stimulus money, and instead of using it on something that was positive or good, they've gone out and they've bought drugs with it. And that's not to criticize the stimulus at all, but it is to criticize people who didn't use their money in a way that was honoring of the taxpayers who paid it in and provided it, or to the other citizens around them. So I think the short answer is yes, we've seen increases in those, not so much in the child abuse area. We have seen it in domestic violence, but we have seen a significant increase among opioid users.
Steve, I have a question or a comment too. First of all, I think you've done a great job of communicating, better than most. I watch a lot of news. There's been so much confusion here and everywhere about, the virus and who can open, who has to stay shut. And I've watched you clarify a lot of that. And I think that's a great job.
Thank you.
I just wondered if you had any general observations or comments about, the virus, as it has affected certainly the legal system, but just various areas that the virus has affected. Obviously the health of people, but the other things that have been affected, and that's what, you've talked some about. But I just wondered if, you had any general observations, kind of stepping back and looking at this. How did we get here and where are we going?
Sure.
So thanks.
Sure. Well, first, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I viewed my role from the very beginning as primarily an information provider during this time. When I looked out and I saw all of the varying both strategies and projections and advice and recommendations and guidance from all these different people, and you saw how widely varied the results of the pandemic were depending upon where you lived, I knew it was going to be a very difficult time for our community. I think some of the things that were helpful was that I had the opportunity through not just the traditional media, but through social media, to communicate directly with folks about what the rules were, if you will. And I noticed that two of my individual posts on my Facebook page for the office, which is District Attorney General 10th Judicial District, had 200,000 personal impressions, which when you think that my district covers 235,000 people roughly, when you have the opportunity to touch a number that approaches your entire district, even though that's spread out across the state and the country, that's very successful, I think. And so we were very proactive. We tried to be up immediately after the governor spoke every day. If he provided an executive order or something, we tried to get that up the next day. And we answered at the office. We're now above 2,500 questions from the public that we have answered since about the second week of April, first and second week of April. So in roughly a month, we've answered over 2,500 questions. And a lot of those have been repetitive, but a lot of those haven't been. One of the most rewarding things to me about this whole situation was that I had the opportunity to work with local business to give them help in staying open in many opportunities. There were many opportunities for local businesses who thought they had to close, but didn't have to close, and we were able to actually walk them through the guidance for their particular industry, or under the catch-all section of the first executive order, which was 21, that shut a lot of things down. So that to me was one of the most exciting things, if you will, about this, was the opportunity to really help people in a way that I never would have imagined I could do it in my role in government as a prosecutor. My overall thoughts about this is that this has been, I think the fact that we didn't know so much about this virus has caused the impact to be greater than it should have been. I think we did not understand. I think the Center for Disease Control, and I have great respect for them, but I think they completely dropped the ball on this circumstance. And I don't blame them. But at some point in time, when you evaluate how you prepare for the next one, I think you have to look at them and say, look, why did you not know more? And why did we receive so many different things from you? I didn't post this. I started to, but my frustration really with them goes to, at first they told us we should wear masks, and then they told us we shouldn't wear masks, and then they told us we should wear masks. And to me, that is a complete failure of government when you don't give the people clear guidance about that. And I hope that they will see things differently. Much as President Obama dealt, I thought, pretty effectively with the H1N1, I think President Trump has treated this virus and responded effectively to it. There's no way to prepare for something that attacks an entire nation simultaneously. And there is no way for us to do some of the things that other countries have done. One of the great things about living in this nation is the amount of freedom that we have. We decided that liberty was more important to us than security on July the 4th of 1776. On that day, when we declared our independence from England and said, regardless of whatever happens to us, we would rather be free than safe. That has been the national motto of this country since its beginning. And I think one of the things that we have learned in this is that people still have that spirit around this country. You look at all the people who went to work every day and didn't think about it. And I'm not talking about your first responders, although I'm greatly respectful and thankful for our first responders. I'm talking about the folks who went to work in our grocery stores, and the folks who went to work in our pharmacies, the folks who drove trucks, and the folks who built. When we think about an essential industry, we've talked a lot about what we would normally think of: doctors and nurses, and people who provide health care services, and people who keep our essentials. But somebody had to make the boxes to store our food, and somebody actually had to box the food, and somebody had to transport it, and somebody had to stock it. And so there were so many people who just said, I'm going to work, and the country's got to stay open. And so I think that's been very refreshing at a time. I think there were a lot of people who wondered how a crisis like this would affect the nation. And so I think my overall impression is that as a nation, this has hopefully made us stronger, certainly more aware and certainly smarter and more efficient, but it's also made us stronger as a nation. I do fear some of the overreach by government that we've seen in other places. To my way of thinking, there have been grave overreaches by government in other places. The Bill of Rights under the Constitution and the Declaration of Rights under the Tennessee Constitution, specifically to us, do not become void during a national emergency. And I think what we should learn from this, and the thing that we should take from this, is that there must be guardrails set up for government, much more significant than there are now, to prevent abuse. I said, I guess it's probably been 3 or 4 weeks ago now, that I was no longer going to enforce the executive orders of Governor Lee. And I want to say this about Governor Lee. He has been restrained in so many ways that other executives across the country have not been. And my opposition, or my decision to not enforce the executive orders, came not so much from some personal disagreement with him, but rather I saw that a barber in Knoxville, Tennessee could open up and make a living, and a barber in Von Orr, Tennessee, which was 24 miles away, was going to be cited or arrested. And I just don't believe that's constitutional. I believe it fails under the Equal Protection Clause. I think it fails under the Due Process Clause. I think that that would have been the worst form of government for us to have persisted in that. And I was joined with only 3 of my 30 colleagues, rather, from across the state, who said publicly they would not. But I just felt like it was important that we made a statement as an office about the preeminence still of our constitutions, and that a national pandemic does not mean, as an American, that we lose our rights, and that government has no right, ability, or power to take from the people those rights. And if we get to the point where we are okay with that, then we have lost our way as a nation, and we frankly have abandoned what began on July the 4th of 1776. So that's sort of my overall thoughts about this. I could go on for days about it, as I'm sure most people could. Most of us have had a lot of time to think about it as we've sat at home and not gone to a restaurant or a theater or anything else. Speaking of which, that's good. All large, or most large capacity attractions will open under guidance tomorrow. So we'll start seeing those reopen again, and we will, I think, be back much more to a normal sort of way of life. So thank you for that question. It's a great question.
Steve?
Yes, sir.
Is the 10-member group still in effect?
It is still in effect, but it's all of that is by recommendation only. It's part of the Tennessee Pledge. There is no longer any requirement. There are no enforceable mandates. And although in my district I made a decision about things across the state, that there are no longer any enforceable mandates that way. I've spoken with several restaurant owners who have reopened, and they have indicated to me that the Department of Health they are doing inspections the way they have been doing. What they are doing is, if someone is not in compliance with the recommendations of the guidance from the Unified Command Task Force under Governor Lee, they are noting that on a health department notation, but they are not taking any enforcement action. They are not citing it as as something that would lower their overall health score. Looking around, though, at most places, I think you're going to see. Let me say this: in restaurants and in large attraction venues, the 10-person is gone. All of those independent number, those sort of arbitrary numbers, are gone. Now it's a 50% occupancy for large attraction venues, and in restaurants you don't even have that. There's no occupancy percentage. Now it is just keep everybody socially distanced. most businesses, I think, are doing that. I've noticed all the stores now. I think the most irritating thing that's come out of this to me, or one of the most irritating things, is the one-way shopping in a grocery store. I am not organized enough to make myself go that direction, and I'm too scatterbrained when I go in there, or I'm hungry and I decide I want something else. And so that has been one of the chief frustrations for me the last couple of weeks. But I think most businesses have done a very good job of maintaining all of these recommendations really from the very beginning. And so they have been responsible for their customers. And again, I don't think we know what the true impact of this virus is. They're saying that maybe 50 to 80 times the number of reported infections exists. If we've got 3 million cases, then that could be 150 million of us, or roughly half the country that's been infected with this, with a huge percentage of those asymptomatic, and with a certain percentage of our population that would be vulnerable, with much more significant and serious results. I think we only need to look to our neighbors in McMinn County to see how devastating this disease can be to a vulnerable person. And so I think businesses have not been so much, they accepted the pledge, and it's not because they felt like they were required to do it. I think it was because they felt like they cared about their neighbor, and they're a lot like me. I don't know how it's transmitted, but I've bought masks, and I try to wear masks when I go out, not because anybody's making me, but because, at least for now, the CDC is telling us to wear them. But also, if the idea is that it's to keep my neighbor safe, then I think certainly as a Rotarian, then that certainly passes our four-way test. And I think if we're going to, one of the easy ways, the flip side of the previous question that I had, that I answered, is absolutely we have all these freedoms, but with freedom comes a remarkable amount of responsibility to be a good citizen. The freedoms we have will allow for the absolute destruction of this nation if we don't exercise responsible citizenship. And the same thing is true here, I think. I don't have to wear a mask. Nobody's going to make me make a mask or wear a mask. And I don't know that it's going to help me or anybody else. But I would much rather do that and do what I think is a beneficial thing, or something that I can't prove is going to harm anybody, then take the chance on not. And so that's, I think overall businesses are good, and we're fortunate now that we should see all the rest of this guidance continue to be lessened as we go forward.
Steve, good morning. Thanks for being with us. And
good morning, Kevin.
Accolades to you, man, because as my father-in-law would tell his congregation when he was pastoring, he said, Christians are like tea bags. You never know what someone's really made of till you get them in hot water. Well, you've been in some hot water and you've come out shining. I think you'll be able to serve as the general for as long as you want to, my friend. So thanks for a job well done. We are planning on opening up our church on Sunday, and all of the common sense things we put in place. But you said so many things that maybe the average person really hasn't thought about. If you were to come to our church Sunday, is there anything that I might not be thinking of that you would have advised me or recommend for me?
Well, Kevin, it is good to see you, first of all. And I appreciate the kind remarks. Let me just say this. I have done nothing. I am empowered and guided by someone who is far much more advanced and far smarter than I am. I am blessed to have trusted in my faith during this period of time. And I also want to say that I certainly could not have done what I did without the tremendous support of my staff. All of my staff were just remarkable, but I'm thankful to God who guided my steps and during this, and I'll continue hopefully to be mindful of that. I think the most of the things are common sense that we see, and it's sort of it's sort of what we learned in kindergarten: hands, feet, and objects to ourselves first, you know, and then sort of the social distancing. I think most people, we did one last at First Baptist where I attend. We did one service before everything kind of shut down, where we had people distanced, and we didn't do that. I don't know. In my discussions with pastors, I don't think that I've seen anybody come out with something I don't think you would already know. Certainly, we want to continue to provide hand sanitizer at every location we can, and social distance, folks. You know, it's an interesting thing when it comes to faith, and when it comes to your faith and to worship, in that we have to balance certain things. And the first thing that the scripture tells us, we're not to live in a spirit of fear. Right. And so when we approach coming to worship, we should come expectantly, and we should come expecting to meet God there. But secondly, you know, there is a Christian responsibility side. And so I think it's perfectly appropriate for churches to begin opening. I cannot imagine that there would be any more danger to a church than there would be people were crawling all over each other at Walmart like meerkats. And I just think that our churches, we find, as long as you're doing the social distancing thing, some churches have talked about doing temperature checks. I think that's a matter of opinion for each church. That's recommended, obviously. But I think the questions, and I think masks and all the things that we've talked about are going to be fine. But I don't have anything in specific that I think you might not think about, in part because we've had so much guidance to so many other businesses as they've opened up. We've had the opportunity to do that. Obviously, one of the questions that I've gotten a couple of times in the last, in the last week or so, has been, how do we handle communion? And I think that is going to be one of the trickier questions for our Episcopal and Catholic brothers and sisters. That's a different sort of perspective than it is for those of us in the Protestant faith, where they may drink from a common cup. And so I think there are some things that they're going to have to deal with differently. But I think one of the things that I would suggest to you is anything that you do related to your service, if you approach it like the restaurants have, I think you're going to be doing well. And I have encouraged a lot of businesses who didn't know exactly, back before we had guidance for like office buildings and that sort of thing, and they would ask me what to do. Many times I just suggested you follow the restaurant guidance.
Well, I appreciate that, and I don't want it to dominate time, but let me just share with something that I shared on my teaching last night, because and you may get a lot of this because there's so many churches across your area that you serve, and that is, quarantine and social distancing is actually a biblical principle in the Old and New Testaments. I'll just use leprosy as one of those. They were quarantined until there was no longer a threat. There were times where social distancing from 7 days up to 40 days until there was no longer a threat to other people. So I don't take offense at being wise, and like you said, the good Lord can give us wisdom, but we're driven by the great commandment that simply says, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Well, that word neighbor means near one. Well, in these times, because there is a threat that we don't understand fully, to love our neighbor, the near one, actually means to love them at a distance. So I think it's actually a matter of great stewardship to observe these. And I just don't want to ever come across as poking my finger in the legal system's eye, or picking a fight, or I want to use the wisdom, but I also don't want to be negligent in any area that I might not be thinking of from a legal standpoint. So I appreciate that.
Sure, absolutely.
I know. Steve Crump, this is Caitlin with the banner. I have a question for you.
Sure.
You mentioned earlier some of the inconsistency with the recommendations versus the mandates. And that kind of matches up with the inconsistency we have seen with just the knowledge about this virus. The number of unknowns is greater than the number of things that we do know, and that kind of impacts how we can take precautions. Can you speak more on how the mixture of mandates versus recommendations has created more confusion in the safety measures that businesses are taking and don't necessarily have to take in the midst of this pandemic?
Sure, and thank you very much. I think that in a time of crisis, the most important function of government is to speak with a calming and informative voice, and then to take measures that are in the mind of public safety. I don't think there is any question but what the government has the ability to alter our behavior for some period of time. We can go back through history and see where, even going back to the founding fathers, where government took initiative when there was a smallpox or a cholera or yellow fever or some particular pandemic, where government took the initiative, if you will, or took the actions that were necessary at the time that were believed were necessary to curtail that emergency. I think the problem here is that government tried to apply a one-step solution to every place in the country. Government took the mindset that we're going to impose. Of course, the federal government didn't impose anything. The federal government left it to the states to do it. But I think what we've seen is that government took we took a hammer to something we should have taken a scalpel to. Nashville and Memphis were affected more significantly than the 10th Judicial District. But for a long time, the rules were exactly the same for all of us. There was no need, in my opinion, for some of the things that happened related to the executive orders for Cleveland, Bradley County, or for the district. If you look at a place like New York State, New York City was an absolute war zone for this. But if you got out of New York City, in particular, you got into northern and western New York State, they had almost no occurrence of it. Now, that may have changed since I last saw that, but that was sort of the situation as it was then. Same thing is true for California, and certainly even for the hot spots in the Southeast. I think it was not so much the fact that there were recommendations and mandates. I think in government, they're going to have to be those things, because there are certain things we can't mandate. With all due respect to Mayor Burke in Chattanooga and to anybody else, you can't just tell somebody they can't have church in this country. You just can't do that. That is one of the freedoms that is absolutely protected. And the Tennessee Constitution is even more significantly protective of that right than the United States Constitution. The Tennessee Constitution and the Declaration of Rights says that the freedom of religion is a fundamental right. And it goes farther down in another section of the Tennessee Constitution, section 11, or in Article 11, I think it's section 16, says that the rights that appear in the Declaration of Rights are wholly those belonging to the people, and the government has no power to even talk about them. I mean, that's the import of what the language says. So there's going to have to be some guidance, and it's not so much, I think, the problem that I think most government officials on a local level, like I am, saw was that for a long time, everybody was treated the same way, no matter what their circumstances were. And then when the 6 counties under Governor Lee were allowed to sort of chart their own course, and the other 89 were kept together, that guidance, to a certain extent, still had no basis on what the circumstances in the ground were. Going back to the example I said earlier, a barber in Knox County, Tennessee, on May the 6th, could open up and start cutting hair and earning a living. But 24 miles down the road, or actually, even though it's not in my district, 15 feet across the Knox County border, a barber giving a haircut is supposed to be arrested or cited. That, to me, was the problem with all this, is that we applied this sort of, there's going to be a set of rules, and there were no criteria for how the rules were going to apply. There was no criteria set up from the beginning to say, we need to have this, but we don't need to do that in this particular area. Now, I recognize that's a huge task, and I recognize that is something that I'm not criticizing any government official for that. But what I am saying is that is, to me, the greatest problem that's come out of this. We've shut every jury trial down in the state of Tennessee under the Tennessee Supreme Court. And I get that. We can't force people to come in and serve as jurors and potentially expose them to it. But if we have no occurrences in this district of this disease at some point, and they're still having them at other points, there is absolutely no reason why we couldn't have a jury trial here. And I think it's just a matter of us being more localized and being more sophisticated as we go forward. And I hope that answers your question.
If I could ask a follow-up.
Sure.
So you had mentioned that, the federal government, obviously they had left some of the decisions up to the states. And I think what you were saying was the recommendations and the things that were given required a more delicate touch than what was actually applied. If it were left up to the counties and on an individual basis based on current case count, do you think that there would have been more confusion given the variation of what 95 counties were doing? And with that, do you think that the widespread closures of everything could have played a role in preventing a larger spread of cases in Bradley County or the 10th Judicial District?
I don't think anything that was done or not done affected anything in Bradley County. Looking at the count, and I'm looking at the count from yesterday, I think we had 85 cases with maybe 69 recovered, I think was the number. And I could go back and find it on here, but when you think that a total of 85 people out of 110,000 in a community get something, I'm not sure anything in the world we did or didn't do would have affected that. Again, if we had been in a real shelter in place where everybody had to stay in their house and you couldn't go out for any reason, then I think we have some way of knowing that. I don't think we have any way of knowing really what worked and what didn't work, specifically because we had this mix of open and closed. We had essential and non-essential. We had plants that were working full steam ahead the whole time this was going on, and you had stores, Walmart and grocery stores and Home Depot and Lowe's and stuff like that, where people were congregating without social distancing for a long time. So I'm not sure that anything in a Bradley County would have affected us. But I think that goes to what I'm not an epidemiologist, and I have no idea what's really correct about this, but it seems to me that where there are these outbreaks, there are typically high concentrations of close contact for extended periods of time. You look at New York City, for a long time, they didn't shut down the subway. And the subway is, if anybody that's been on the subway in New York City or anywhere else knows that that's a very, you were in close quarters with people there for a long period of time, depending on where your stop is. I think that what we have to look at is not, we have to be safe, and we can't abridge people's rights, period. Again, the Constitution is clear, but as we do start figuring out, I pray we'll never have another one of these, but history tells us we will. And I hope we will be more, we will try to understand the virus on an effect basis more locally than we did. And certainly when we get to the point where we are willing to reopen things, if you will, that we really apply it then. That was my main concern about this. It's not so much on the front end what happened, but when it became clear in a number of counties that there was literally no effect. Polk County, Tennessee, I think they've had 18 cases, 16 of which are recovered, no hospitalizations, no deaths. Meigs County, Tennessee, roughly the same numbers, no hospitalizations, no death. Bradley County, Tennessee, 85, I think, total cases. I don't know the number of hospitalizations, 1 death, but as I understand it, that was a Chattanooga resident that actually came to Bradley County and not actually a Bradley County resident. When you look at those numbers, that is a far different result than Chattanooga or Nashville, and they are far different than the national average and a far cry from a place like New York. So what I hope that the CDC and the epidemiologists and task forces, both on the state and national level, will, as a local official who's been charged with trying to enforce a mandate, that they will look and be more in tune with what the circumstance is, if not on a county basis, on a regional basis. I think the federal government was wise to leave it to the states. And look, I'm not criticizing Governor Lee for anything he did. I don't know what I would have done if I were the governor. It's easy. Are there things I think I would have done differently? Absolutely. We all would do that. There are plenty of people in this community who think if they were sitting in my position that they would do things differently than I'm doing them. That really, as someone who sits in an elected office, that doesn't take into account what the balances and the tensions are within that office that have to be managed. And so I'm not going to be critical of Governor Lee at this point. I tried to not be critical even when I said I wasn't going to enforce his orders. I think I do believe that Governor Lee has tried his best to not have a circumstance of mandating too many things. And I do think that he saw that there were certain things that could not be curtailed, such as worship attendance. And from the very beginning, that was left open. So I think that the one thing that was confusing to people was that they would look and see that they not only did they not see the disease, they didn't know anybody who was COVID-19 positive in a place like this. They didn't know anybody that had died. They didn't know anybody that was very sick. They heard about it in other places. And that confused people when they said, what's the big deal? And it's the reason I think that people, when they didn't socially distance or do those other things, why they didn't do it. So I hope that answers your question, your follow-up.
Yes, thank you. And I don't want to bogart the question time, but I did have one last question, which was,
Sure.
You had mentioned a number of things guaranteed to, Tennessee residents or, anyone in the United States by the Bill of Rights and the Tennessee Constitution. Can you be more specific about some of the rights that may have been infringed upon by some of the government actions?
Well, I think that the potential existed on the freedom of association, the freedom of assembly. There was some idea that people could not meet to protest. For example, we had protests that people wanted to open the state. We came to the conclusion very early, as I think every other jurisdiction did, that no matter what an executive order said about not having 10 people meeting in a social or other kind of gathering, you couldn't stop people from petitioning their government for redress by an assembly. Here, we didn't see that. Okay, we did not see that. But the closures and the problems that I saw with it were more due process and equal protection type problems than they were some overall violation of the constitutional rights of a Tennessee citizen. But you did see it and are continuing to see it in other places. And you're beginning to see pushback. For example, you saw the the woman that was arrested in Dallas, Texas, I believe it was, for opening her hair salon in violation of the executive order there. She was arrested, was charged with contempt, and was going to have to serve 7 days. And then the Supreme Court, I think, of Texas stepped in and said, no, that's not enforceable. And the idea is government can't take a property right from you without just compensation. And if government tells you you can't go to work, you can't earn a living, at some point in time, that becomes a taking. They can impose, for example, let's say your business is in a district that's hit with a tornado. Government can restrict your access to that area while they're doing cleanup and while they're putting power up, because there's this generalized public safety that's necessary. But they then can't say, well, we're not sure yet that it's safe for everybody to go back in after that emergency has been dealt with, and keep you without some sort of compensation. And I think you will see across the country. I think the first lawsuit I'd seen was filed yesterday against government for a taking without compensation. So it's not so much the enumerated rights that I think were violated as much as it is the idea of government taking something without compensation. In other places, the freedom of travel, while it's no right is unrestricted, we have the right to travel. Where states closed their borders and counties closed their borders, I'm not sure how you do that under the constitutional republic that we live in, because we have the implicit in our freedom of association is the freedom of travel, which means I can go to the state of Florida. Now, they can tell me what to do once I get there. They can quarantine me or whatever they want to do. Certainly, that's part of what happens. But to me, it was not necessarily an enumerated right that I see more much as it is that so much of the economic freedom of Americans were taken without some form of potentially without some form of compensation.
Thank you so much. We sure appreciate you coming and being with us today, Steve.
Sure.
Thank
Hey, it's
you.
my pleasure. Anytime.
And thank you for all you do. Okay, and just be sure to track your volunteer hours on anything that you do for Rotary or in the community, and get those hours to Lisa when you can. Okay, if you guys would join me in the 4-way test of the things we think, say, or do. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? Thank you, Sunrise Rotarians and Rotarian Crump. You guys go out and make it a great day.
And thank you, Steve.